My name is Emanuel Kulczycki, and I'm the head of Scholarly Communication Research Group at the Adam Mickiewicz University in Poznań, Poland. And I welcome you at our seminar on science and semi-peripheries. And today we have a great pleasure to have Lucía Céspedes as our guest speaker. Lucía is an advanced PhD candidate on Latin American social studies at the National University of Cordoba, Argentina. Lucía holds a doctoral grant from the National Scientific and Technical Research Council, CONICET, and she majored in social communication and specialized in scientific journalism and communication of science at the National University of Cordoba, and she also is an assistant professor at the School of Law at the same university. Lucía will provide her presentation entitled Castellano, Portuguese, English, the languages of sciences in the Latin American scientific fields. Lucía will have around 40-45 minutes. And later we will open the floor for the discussion. So, Lucía, it's great to have you here, and the floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Emmanuel, for that presentation, and thank you all of you for joining. As he said, this is part of my doctoral thesis research, which is scaringly coming to an end soon. So I will be presenting some of the preliminary results with you. And let me see now, this is the moment where you'll have to say that, yes, Lucy, we can see your screen.
Yes, Lucy, we can see your screen.
Perfect. So let's go to full screen. Okay, so this is the title of my presentation, Castellano, Português, English. And the question is about the languages, not just one language of sciences, not just one science, in the Latin American scientific field. My point of departure is the assumption that linguistic struggles are never exclusively about language itself. Language choice is not only about language. Linguistic ideologies, prestige, representations don't have to do with language only. There's also always something more at stake there. And therefore, I truly believe that approaching the scientific field from a social linguistic point of view, focusing on the way that scientists communicate and interact, it is a privileged outlook. It's a great point of view to delve deeper into the logic, the structures of the field, and to be able to say something about the world through the lenses of language. So my aim, let's say, is to bring together these three areas, the social studies of science and technology, social linguistics, and always bearing in mind and keeping in mind the strong foundations of social theory, of sociology, anthropology, linguistics that we need to be keeping in mind and never letting go. Because otherwise we are only, I don't know, sociologists who forget about the social part and focus on the science only or on the language only, but we should always be keeping these theoretical foundations very, very strongly. And let's say that within all the aspects that we can focus on within the social studies of science and technology, this is what I want to be looking at. Something that I bet everyone in this room is familiar with, the process of reading a dozen papers just to pick a couple of quotes that we'll write in a paragraph and call it a article, and so on and so on. And speaking about theoretical foundations, I have to say that I'm obnoxiously Bourdieusian. So this is the point of view that I'm taking, seeing the scientific and academic field as a place of struggle where prestige is allocated and different agents endowed with different volumes and different kinds of capital engage in struggles. But also, these fields can be seen as linguistic markets where symbolic goods, symbolic products in sciences, mainly in the form of academic texts, the famous papers, circulate and also contribute to this allocation of prestige, of capital, and therefore language plays a very important role in these structures of communication and interaction within the scientific field. A little bit more of this theoretical framework. If we see practice as the meeting point where the habitus, as described by Bourdieu, meets the field, where the history of the field becomes incorporated, the discursive practice, what we do and what we act through languages, can be seen as the habitus meeting certain linguistic market conditions. And therefore, we are taking a broad perspective of linguistic competence, not limited to grammar or rhetoric or the ability to write, but also as a practical sense of being in the field, what Salo has called the linguistic sense of placement within the field, the perception of my own resources and those of the ones around me. And also I try to take a more flexible perspective on languages, not seen as abstract bounded entities, discrete entities. Spanish is from here to here, and after that it's French, and they are all in these little square boxes. But I like to think, together with Ian Blommaert and other scholars, that as we go on our social trajectories among different scientific fields, we constantly incorporate semiotic resources into our repertoires, which can correspond to different languages, but which are tools that we can use and deploy in order to meet different communicative aims. And well, that as for the specific activity of writing and publishing in academia, we are going to think about it as a networked activity, because even if you are writing a solo article or you're writing your thesis dissertation by yourself, you're never writing alone. So how do we bring all these theoretical framework apparatus into Latin America? Because we have to be careful when we extrapolate these categories into specific contexts, especially when they were originally posed in the global north, and we are translating these frameworks into other contexts. Latin America is a region whose societies have been described as structurally heterogeneous, which are torn between autonomy and heteronomy, especially in the scientific field, and that can be characterized as a periphery or semi-periphery in the world scientific system and the world system in general. This is also another theoretical current that I'm standing on. And within Latin America, we have two main hegemonic languages, Spanish and Portuguese. Also a panoply of Native American languages or Aboriginal languages, which have different degrees of recognition from the nation states. In particular, Argentina and Brazil will be my objects of study because these are countries that act as scientific centers within this semi-peripheral region that is Latin America. Both show strong scientific traditions, which have common traits as well as differences. Nowadays, both have a vast network of research centers. Most of them are publicly state-funded, and universities. They have a history of academic collaborations, which is growing every day. So there is quite an interest in these compared studies between Argentina and Brazil. My case studies in particular were 4 here to the left, 4 what we call executive units of the CONICET, which is the National Scientific and Research Council, which we call them double dependency units because they depend institutionally on CONICET and different national universities. In this case, the National University of Córdoba, which is the second oldest in the Americas and the second largest in Argentina. So we have one institute, the first one, devoted to neuroscience and medical sciences, the second one to astronomy. This one is the Institute for Humanities, and last but not least, political sciences and law. And their Brazilian counterparts, which I've interviewed, are 2 institutes based at the Unicamp, the University of Campinas in the state of Sao Paulo, which is also a very prominent research-oriented university in Brazil. And in these cases, I worked with the Institute for Computer Sciences and the Institute of Philosophy and Humanities. So we have a couple of institutes which we can identify as mainly devoted to STEM disciplines, you know, science, technology, engineering, mathematics, natural sciences, hard sciences, what you may call it, and another 3 devoted to social sciences and humanities, because that is my main goal, to establish differences and comparisons, but also similarities between disciplines, between countries, and also between different instances in the academic trajectory. This is from the PhD candidate passing through the postdoctorate stage until we get to the permanent researcher or professor stage. This was my methodology, which of course had to be adapted because of the pandemic. As a first entrance to the field, I conducted a series of structured interviews and some observations within the laboratories and the observatories here in Argentina. After that, I sent out a survey to these 3 PhD candidates, postdocs, and researchers. And after that, a series of semi-structured interviews and more deeply developed through Google Meet because of the pandemic, of course. So let's go to some of the highlights, the most interesting results that I want to share with you. First of all, in terms of the languages that these scholars use to consult literature, to look up material, to keep up to date with their disciplines advances and what's going on in their areas, we can establish like 2 if this was a spectrum from monolingualism to multilingualism. Not surprisingly, the STEM disciplines, remember, medical sciences, astronomy, and computer sciences, are practically dominated by English, with a very marginal mention of Spanish and Portuguese as languages in which these scholars begin their publication paths, but which are not the ones that count, let's say, the ones that will have the most weight and the most value in scientific publications. And they are definitely languages that these scientists' information are expected to, let's say, leave behind as they progress in their trajectories. On the other hand, in the social sciences and humanities, and this is in both countries, Spanish and Portuguese, of course, still have a very, very relevant place, as well as English. Most scholars in these areas, remember, humanities, philosophy, political science, law, said that they read the academic works in their first language, whether it is Spanish and Portuguese, and they incorporate also English. But we also have mentions of French, which is still very relevant, of German and Italian to a lesser extent, and even, let's say, more exotic languages such as Greek, Russian, or Japanese, depending on the characteristics of the object of study of each particular scholar. Because that's one main takeaway. In the STEM disciplines, we have a very strong influence of the field's macrostructures, the publication circuits, the editorial houses, the indexes where journals are included, whereas in the social sciences and humanities, the languages that scholars use and engage with are much more determined by the traits and the characteristics of their own research. Because I study this author and I need to read their original works, because I study this national context, so I need to conduct my research in this language. So those kinds of examples. And so therefore we can talk about a linguistic division of scientific work. In the social sciences and humanities, the languages that scholars use to build up their theory and to keep up to date with theoretical debates and so on is not necessarily the same as the one they use to conduct research in archives, to read documental sources, to build up their corpuses, those who work with literature, for example, to conduct field work or to select their case studies. I myself had to conduct interviews in Portuguese, and that was quite demanding, but also a very interesting challenge in terms of incorporating semiotic resources into my repertoire. Whereas in the STEM disciplines, this division is not observed within the scientific field, because almost the only space for incorporating Spanish, Portuguese, or any other local languages will be in instances of public communication of science, of outreach activities from the universities, or public engagement, or things like that. But we are not talking anymore about communications among peers. So the space for local languages will depend on the genres of the texts that we are producing or the communication we are engaging in, and who the recipient is. So in terms of actually publishing in a second language, we can see that there is a progression. Here are the numbers for Argentina, PhD candidates. The blue is yes, the orange is no. haven't published a lot in a second language. This trend reverts completely when we advance to the postdoc, and almost every researcher that I've surveyed in Argentina has published in a second language. In Brazil, the trend is very similar, if more pronounced. PhD candidates seem to be engaging in multilingual writing and publication a bit earlier than Argentinians. And this may be due to the fact that even though Brazil has a tremendously, the volume of the editorial market and circuits of Brazil is much bigger and larger than that of Argentina and every other Latin American country even, there still persists this issue of the between brackets, let's say, the linguistic isolation of Brazil as the only main Portuguese speaking country in Latin America. So in order to engage in the regional debates, the Latin American issues, PhD candidates in Brazil are resorting either to Spanish or English. And this can be seen in the languages most used for academic publishing. We can see that there is a core of students mainly from the STEM disciplines that I mentioned that are publishing in English, and that Portuguese and Spanish still hold a very high relevance for early career scholars in particular. I apologize, I didn't bring the graphics for postdocs and researchers, but the trend is the same. Portuguese and Spanish still have a stronghold here in Argentina, and if we include the possibilities of communicating with Spain and Portugal, well, that increases. So with this scenario, we need to remember that science not only the science that matters is not only the one that is indexed in Scopus or Web of Science, but as we can see, Latin American scholars are participating in a number of other publishing circuits that depend on other logics, not just the prestige and, we have to say it, for-profit aims of major publishing houses, which are the strongest players in these mainstream publishing circuits. And as Fernanda Weigel says here, these 4 circuits that we can identify are the result of an uneven play field, let's say. But they also raise the question as to which area of the scientific field is more autonomous. If we think of autonomy with Bourdieu as the capacity of establishing the field's own logics, which are internal to the field, let's say, and not having this influence of external agents. Well, in the STEM disciplines, we see almost no choice in terms of scientific trajectories and publication outlets. The only possibility that matters, that will be valued as legitimate science by the peers and, importantly, by the national performance evaluation regimes, will be that published in English in international journals, which are indexed in these very prestigious and selective indexes. On the other hand, the social sciences and humanities, which have historically been accused of being politically motivated and having their scientific status questioned, have more options. The scholars in these areas really can choose whether to engage in international mainstream English language publications. And this is not exclusive, because they can also be publishing in their local languages or other scientific languages, according to the characteristics of their own research, their own objects of study, and according to the discourse and practice communities that they've identified as their interlocutors and that they wish to engage in dialogue with. Of course, writing in a second language is difficult, and many challenges were reported by the scholars that I've interviewed, also surveyed. Many have to do with the effort, the time, the energy that comes from having to write in a second language, and also having to comply with the demands from editors and reviewers, which, as we know, act as gatekeepers, not only of the scientific content of papers being published, but also as gatekeepers of what is considered appropriate academic language. And in particular, if we are publishing in English, that can be very, very difficult to achieve. And also in the comments that I received in the survey and in the interviews, we can see a prevalence still of the native speaker paradigm as the standard of linguistic correctness from these multilingual scholars themselves. So I'm sorry, I only included Spanish quotes here, my bad. I had a number of Portuguese nice ones as well. But the idea is that still trying to write like the natives, trying to speak like the natives is the goal. And from from applied linguistics, from linguistics in general, the native speaker paradigm is being increasingly questioned, but it is still a very prevalent representation in these scholars' perspectives. And something that we also should mention is the material obstacles, because those who are not confident enough to write their own texts in English or Portuguese or Spanish, let's say, if we are, changing countries, or whatever other language that that we want to publish in, should have a professional translator or a copy editor or someone who can proofread the text. And in many cases, there is not much institutional support in that area. And as always, Latin American science institutions and universities are riddled by financial problems. The budgets are very low. So this part of the scientific work, which is writing and publishing, is not considered, usually is not considered as a priority in subsidies or budget allocation. But we should highlight that the University of Campinas, the Unicamp, the university that I worked with in Brazil, does have what they call Espaço de Escrita, which is a writing space that provides their professors and researchers with support in for free in these areas for translations and for checking and revision of texts. And if we think about the material difficulties in a broader sense, not only when we have already reached the stage of being a researcher, being a PhD candidate, etc. And we can go back in time, we can start thinking of who had the opportunity to attend to a bilingual school or to pay for language classes before entering the scientific field, because that accounts for an accumulation of semiotic resources that is very unequal among the scholars that I've talked with. And something that is also very important and that can compensate for this lack of semiotic resources, lack of confidence, or lack of material resources to hire professionals, is the role of literacy brokers, as Lillis and Curry have defined them. These are a sort of middle people. I don't want to say middlemen because they can also be women, but agents that intervene and help to mediate in text production, which can be peers, can be tutors, mentors, co-authors, collaborators, and that very interestingly weren't identified as a resource or a strategy in the survey, but in every interview, the scholars never failed to mention them in both countries, to mention these brokers as very important factors in their text production. And in general, tutors, mentors, whether it's the official, let's say, thesis supervisor or just a senior scholar, were seen as important models for writing, whereas peers were identified as safe spaces, let's say, for oral practice, because we shouldn't forget that science isn't limited to text production. We are having an academic exchange orally right now, and so this moment of having to orally express ideas or defend an argument or give a presentation was the main source of anxiety and insecurities for scholars of both countries. And in that aspect, peers were identified as those that I can practice with, that I can test my poster presentation, for example, with, and who won't be making fun of me and who will help me improve in my oral skills. And finally, something very, very interesting that sparked the most debate was this issue of, okay, so what do we do? Do we accept the fact that science is communicated, again, mainstream international science is communicated in practically one language? What about the growth of English as a higher education medium in many universities, which are not set in Anglophone countries, but which are offering more and more courses in English, for example? And here we had a spectrum of answers and of positions between this end of total disagreement, no, there should not be one global language for sciences, to agreement with this statement. So scholars recognized the role that English is already having as the hegemonic language of sciences, as something that already happens, especially in astronomy, medical sciences, and computer sciences, as something that is increasingly taken for granted, that is taken as a given. And I resist the term lingua franca to talk about English, because as many scholars have argued, a lingua franca should be a symmetrical language, which is nobody's first language, and which only acts as a contact language. But this is not the case with English. English is the first language of some of the most powerful centers in knowledge production and circulation in the world. So it's not a symmetrical language. But the agents that I've interviewed also recognize the pragmatic and communicative advantages that this entail. Once again, I'm speaking in English right now, and you are all from different countries and different linguistic backgrounds, and we can share and engage in a debate on the very issue of language in a very meta-linguistic way. At the same time, scholars from the social sciences and humanities highlighted the impossibility to translate and universalize in a completely faithful way. There's always something that gets lost in translation. And in particular, not only talking about epistemic and theoretical traditions that may be non-Western, that may be non-central, that may come from the global South, and that may be very difficult to translate into the accepted languages of science, but also the difficulty to translate rhetorical styles, because in English we have this tendency to write one topic sentence, a couple of backup ideas, and round up a paragraph in a very straightforward way, while in other more Latin traditions, rhetoric has a different style, and scholars which have been socialized into these other ways of writing and expressing themselves and putting across their ideas find many obstacles in translating their whole ways of thinking and of conducting research and conducting science. But of course, it's not a unsurmountable obstacle. Once again, there were linguistic, rhetorical, and material disadvantages mentioned to this idea of one global language. And as I mentioned right now, the sense of linguistic and epistemic unfairness derived from the fact that not only is English language the thing that is increasingly globalized, but also the Anglo-Saxon way of conducting science, conducting research, and these criteria that are reinforced by gatekeepers in the most powerful and prestigious editorial houses or journals, because they stem from the centers of academic production and scientific production, tend to be taken as universals and incorporated by scientists all around the world, and as I mentioned earlier, also incorporated by policymakers and in the evaluation regimes of different countries, different contexts, and different linguistic backgrounds. So to sum up and to give way to the debate and the talk with you, with this, I neither seek to demonize English nor to romanticize the use of local languages in sciences, because we should also bear in mind that in Latin America, both Spanish and Portuguese are part of the heritage of the colonization of this region, and as English seems to be occupying more and more spaces, Spanish and Portuguese can be said to be to have displaced local languages, which could also be applied to academia and to scientific thinking if given the chance. So I think that is the main takeaway that I wanted to share with you. To study the conditions and the perceptions and the strategies that scholars from a semi-peripheral region are deploying in order to be heard, in order to add their voices in what is seen as a almost monolingual English choir. But if we tune our ears more more carefully, we can really hear different dissonant voices in the in this concert of global science. So I think that's about it for now. Thank you very much to all of you for listening, and there's my contact if you want to keep talking about this after the seminar. Thank you.
Thank you, Lucy, for very inspiring and thought-provoking presentation. I found it extremely interesting to me, and I'm pretty sure that we will have a lot of questions and discussion will be fruitful. I will open the floor in a minute, so please use the button to raise your hand if you would like to ask the question, and I will use my privilege as the moderator of our seminar to ask the first question. Because Lucy, you mentioned that you have conducted interviews during the pandemic via Google Meet, and I wonder whether researchers did mention the COVID-19 pandemic as the example showing that we need communication in science in many languages to inform public and to inform professionals in our countries. Even in the STEM fields, we need publishing in not only in English to be in line with our colleagues from the global science, but also in Spanish and Portuguese, because it's the fastest way to facilitate science spreading in the pandemic, for example. Was it the issue or not during your interviews?
No, actually, the pandemic didn't come up as a topic in my interviews, because I was very aware that many of us have been suffering from what has been called this Zoom fatigue, and I was asking these already overworked scholars to share some more of their time with me and to spend more time in front of a screen talking to me. So the pandemic was sort of the elephant in the room that we didn't address directly. But what you say is very true, and it can be seen in the number of scientists, and especially those in the medical sciences, that have taken to public communication of science, that have taken to social networks, especially Twitter or, I don't know, Instagram, in order to put across reliable information in their own languages. In many cases, for example, translating papers or giving the link to a preprint in English, but explaining the core content of what this new treatment or this new vaccine meant, so that it could be more easily shared, and also as a way of fighting disinformation in each of our national contexts.
Thank you. And we are opening the floor. I see that some of you turn on cameras, so probably would like to ask the question. Staszek, please.
Hello, thank you very much for the talk. It has been particularly interesting to me because I'm thinking about doing a study about somewhat similar things in Poland. And one of the things I've been wondering is that in Poland, it seems that we have two competing discourses about the international aspects of science. We have the discourse of internationalization, which mostly focuses on English language publications, and we have a counter discourse, so to speak, which could be described as a local or national discourse emphasizing the role of languages written in national languages, local languages. And then there is this middle ground that seems not to have been paid that much attention to, the regional middle ground, so to speak. And you have mentioned this in your presentation regarding CONICET, for instance, I believe. So what I would like to ask you is whether in your research has something significant come up with regard to this regional level, so to speak, especially with regard to how maybe focusing on it, trying to study it more, could possibly give us some insight into the things that academics already do, but the things that are not covered by either the internationalization discourse or the counter local discourse.
Yes, absolutely. I think that's an area of vacancy because this has been reported that mainstream databases or indexes are biased towards English or to English language publications or to Anglophone countries, journals. But that's only a part of the picture. It's only a part of the story. And again, it doesn't mean that the science done outside Web of Science and Scopus is not valuable, is not solid, is not remarkable. It's just science that isn't taken into account by the global centers, but that can have a very, very important impact on the regional or national instances. So yes, I think that we should be definitely looking more into that. In Latin America, there has been a growing interest in our own databases and indexes such as Cielo, Latindex, Redalic, which were conceived as a, let's say, options besides these big prestigious international mainstream, etc., and that have become quite strong in the last decades. So yes, I definitely think that we should be looking more into that, especially because especially in the social sciences and humanities, many scholars that I've interviewed said that publishing in their own languages or either Spanish, Portuguese, or doing the effort in publishing in the other, let's say for Spanish speakers and Portuguese speakers, is also a political gesture. So yes, I think that that's a dimension that really needs to be more researched.
Thank you.
Thank you. And I see that Kyria raises your hand. So Kyria, please.
Thank you. Can you hear me well? My voice is not
very well.
Suffering from COVID, so my voice is not very good. Thank you, Lucia, very much for your talk. As usual, I'm very inspired and happy to hear you. I included one of your references that I have cited and read many times in a partial answer to Stanislaw in terms of regional and how, I mean, the role of regional in this global versus local exchange. And I think one of the interesting findings in this paper and that you addressed in a way today and that I would like to comment in relation to later work of Mary Jane Curry, is the fact that the regional is, of course, affected by local and global, and Brazil is one example, though it comes as the leader in volume and in terms of number of papers in Latin America. When we consider its regional role, then we see that the picture, I mean, there is no convergence or no correspondence between the use of Portuguese in publications and the leadership of Brazil. And that is, of course, affected by the regional position of the country and also by the language, which, like Lucia said, does not have an international take as Spanish, for example. And I was just, I think it was very interesting, Lucia. Last week I was listening to a webinar by Mary Jane Curry, and she was sort of looking at other languages that are part of publication. And it's interesting that when you say that, okay, so should we look at English as the academic lingua franca? And when she talks about the role of English, she mentions that we have to be careful about what we are counting, because very often English is the hegemonic or academic lingua franca because the way we are counting and evaluating production, because there are many other languages out there that are being used in production. And I can see here one of my colleagues, Enrique Reiner from Chile, now working in Mexico. And Enrique, like you, Lucia, help us reflect very much about the role of other languages used in the production, which is not only considered in publications, in many other aspects of what we do in university, talking to colleagues, teaching, and that are not counted in research. So I just wanted to thank you, Lucia, Enrique, and many other colleagues who have helped me think about this very important issue, and say that perhaps we have to think about what we are counting, how we are measuring, because this is, of course, important in the global, regional, and local aspects. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Kyria, for your words. And yes, I totally agree. The way that we are counting science right now is through papers. But there is much more to scientific practice considered integrally as a whole than that, and especially because we most of the time in these bibliometric or scientometric types of studies, we are not even reading the papers. We are just counting them and stripping those texts of their conditions of production. Because a paper that seems completely written in a monolingual, standard academic English style may come from a history of drafts in different languages, of review sessions, of crossing out words, of translating back and forth, and that is also doing science. And that is conducted not necessarily in English only. So yes, I think that we should also let's say take more into account the everyday practices of science, what goes on in our laboratories, in our offices, in our classrooms, and not the final product that will add one more point to our resumes, let's say.
Lucy, I would like to ask you about one of the terms you use, that is global language. And I wanted to ask you, because you often use the term global language and you refer to lingua franca, and sometimes you refer to local languages, regions. And I wonder, because it's extremely interesting from perspective of Europe, in which there is no one common language as it is almost in Latin America. How do you perceive the call for many international languages, not one global language in science, but many international languages? Because often it is raised that there are international languages in science. It is Spanish in Latin America, it might be Portuguese, it is Arabic in Northern Africa, and maybe it is one of the solutions to cross over the hegemony of English in science, that is many international languages. But I wanted to ask you, because I have no experience in Europe to have one language like Spanish, like in Latin America. How do you perceive this issue?
Well, I'm not gonna lie, it makes it easier that I can go to Chile or Bolivia or Peru or Mexico, and we all speak the same language. So it does make it easier. But in terms of initiatives to really embrace multilingualism, like you said, I think it comes down to a matter of resource allocation and political will from the part of the institutions of science, of research, and of teaching. Because whether it's offering courses or translations or taking up those courses, taking up the challenge to learn a new language demands a lot of time, effort, and money. So I think we don't have one straight answer to that, but I do believe in the value of having multiple languages and one common language that we can resort to when everything else fails, let's say. Yes, I don't think I have an answer for you right now. I should think about that more, but I really believe that if we are to foster multilingualism, it should come from the bottom up, but also have the will to make policy in that direction from the other way around, from the top to the bottom.
Thank you. And I see two hands, Franek and Zehra. Franek.
Yeah, thank you very much for your talk and for brilliant discussion right now. But I had a question about one thing that you mentioned during presenting your theoretical framework, and I was wondering, were you able to develop it during the research? Because you mentioned that the Latin America is not only semi or peripheral region of science in terms of some kind of internal scientific logic that can be taken from Bourdieu, but it's also the semi or periphery of the whole world system, and from this big economic geopolitical perspective. And I was wondering, did you during your research could highlight some aspect of this world system peripherality that clearly influenced somehow the language used by also some struggles that authors that your research was facing?
Yes, well, thank you very much, Fran, for your question. And yes, that is definitely the bigger picture, let's say. In Latin America, as I said, we have become integrated into the world scientific system in what this author Pablo Kramer calls a subordinate way of integration, let's say. that happens quite frequently, where we still see that the theoretical and methodological models come from the global north or the centers, and the peripheries are expected to take them up acritically. That is not the case. As reads a book that I liked very much, The South Answers Back, and we always have this degree of autonomy to produce our own theories, our own debates, and to look at our realities, especially in the social sciences, to look at our realities with our own eyes and our own categories, especially in the specifically, I mean, in the field of sciences and academia. The concentration of resources and the volume of the national scientific systems in Latin America is very marked. As Kyria said, Brazil is a giant that makes everyone else in Latin America look little in comparison, both in the number of researchers, of PhD candidates, of institutions, and also in the editorial aspect, in the amount of papers produced, and of the own Brazilian journals that are edited and that are also maintained during the years. Then we can mention Argentina and Mexico, and those would be the three biggest and more traditional also scientific systems in terms of resource allocation. And in the later years, Chile and Colombia have had a very significant growth, especially in terms of publications. So I think that something very interesting there is that a country that can be a center within this peripheral region that is Latin America in terms of scientific research may not be necessarily at the same time a center for scientific publishing. So I think that is very interesting, and these two are like interconnected avenues, you know, publishing and editing and the editorial and linguistic market through which science circulates, and the research scientific system itself. And I think not enough attention has been paid to the way that they interconnect, definitely not in terms of policy making. And I think that that's an area that we should be really looking into, especially when we draw up budgets and allocate resources, which are always scarce in Latin America for sciences, and we have to be constantly fighting for those. I don't know if I've answered your question.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah,
but I tried.
Yeah.
Okay, Zehra, please join us.
Thank you. First of all, I would like to thank you for this amazing presentation. I would like to ask something about, you said fostering multilingualism is important for science. I'm living in Turkey, and in Turkey, if you want to get a degree of associate professorship, you have to publish at least 3 papers in local language journals indexed in Turkish Citation Index, because they would like to foster multilingualism, Turkish language publications. But the researchers' perceptions like good ideas, good papers worth publishing in international English language journals, even if they are on local issues, they are on Turkish politics, even if they are just for local subject, because the system gives more point to English language journals. They try to foster national language science or local language science, but the researchers' perception for language is different. I'm wondering, do you have any experience like this about researchers' expectations of their papers, their perceptions about the quality of their papers? I'm just wondering the situation in Latin America, because in Turkey, everyone knows that Turkish language literature is not good, and they have to publish it. They publish their papers in these journals. This is just an obligation for them.
Right. Well, that's very interesting in terms of, you mentioned it, it's a system. The system gives more points, or even in some countries, there's an economic reward if you publish a certain number of papers in Q1 journals or whatever. But I think that if we want to change that, the evaluation regimes are a very important place to start with. As you mentioned that you are asked to publish in Turkish language and in local journals. Here in Argentina in particular, the National Research Council for the Social Sciences and Humanities, they have a special rule where papers published in journals that are indexed in Cielo, which is this Latin American, I think it's Ibero-American actually, because it includes, correct me, Kyria, Evandro, and Rainer, if I'm wrong, but it includes Latin America, Spain, Portugal, and also South Africa. So this is a regional transnational index, which prioritizes, of course, papers and journals that are international, of course, but are international for this part of the world, let's say. And the CONICET counts papers published in journals that are indexed in this index at the same value or rank of importance as those published in Scopus, Web of Science, and so on and so on. So I think those are political gestures that are scientific officers, let's say, whether it's the ministries, the education ministers, or whatever, need to be taking, because yes, the way that scholars and institutions are assessed is one of the main factors that will be orienting their strategies and their calculations of where should I publish, where is it more profitable to publish. And if there are more incentives and also, again, resources allocated to ensure the quality of regional or national journals, well, there we have a way of changing the system a bit to make it more fair, or at least to have more options.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Staszek, please, I see you just raised your hand.
Yeah, I have another question. Maybe I can develop it more in an email later, but basically it's a theoretical question. So you've mentioned you've been using the theory of Pierre. I've been using it at my PhD. I've had some problems trying to make it encompass regional or global issues, because well, there's the whole difficulty with translating it from national scope to transnational scope. But I'm also thinking about this this level that we can tentatively call regional. That it's not just Bourdieu that seems to need some work to be able to for us to be able to use him, but also when I think about the world systems theory, it is a bit binary in that there is the division between center and peripheries. Of course, there are semi-peripheries, but sometimes it feels maybe like an addition to the model. So the question would be whether you think there is some conceptual work or theoretical work being done regarding this middle level, regional level, regarding this level that may not have been theorized the best in the dominant conceptions or theories that we tend to use.
Well, first of all, yes, I agree that the issue of internationalizing Bourdieu and how the field can be thought of outside national borders is a very long question. And I think it also has to do with the fact that when Bourdieu was writing, again, he was in a very central position, especially in terms of cultural production. So he had no need to specify, I'm talking about France, you know, the intellectual field that he was describing was the intellectual field. And so, yes, I think it's theoretically, it's a very interesting exercise to adapt this theory to transnational and globalization contexts. And I do think that in the journal called Tapuja, which Emmanuel and your group has recently published, well, that is a very, very rich resource on theory, really, produced from Latin America on and they are very concerned with these issues of knowledge circulation, integration, how scientific peripheries or semi-peripheries or centers are codependent on each other, and how these positions are fixed or can be mobile. So I think I take a look there. And of course, let's keep talking and create and make our own theory. That's the fun of it.
Thank you.
Thank you. And Rainer, please, I see you raised hand.
Well, hello, everyone. Good morning. This conference started when it was 7 o'clock in the morning here in Mexico. Thanks for having me here. And the main reason why I joined this very early conference was to know Lucía in person, who I don't know so far. And since right now I'm not planning to travel to Argentina, and I suppose Lucía is not planning to travel to Mexico right now, so we have to meet on Zoom like everyone else. I'm interested in very similar fields as Lucía and Kyria do. But I think we have to think about these things a bit in a bit more radical way. Bibliometrics is building a big fantasy about which publications are relevant through Scopus and citation index, and we have to get away from that. It's simply not the case. I mean, I have an article published in English a long time ago, which is cited, well, not very often, but somehow often, and it has been read or downloaded in over 100 countries, where people cite me only with a small sentence, which is not for me, where I say, well, publications are 80–90% in English today in the natural sciences, and whatever, I can't remember the figure, 70% in the rest. And the whole article is about saying, well, that doesn't matter. That isn't so important. We have to look at other things. But people keep quoting this because they don't read articles. 90% of the articles quoted today by authors are not read by these authors. They read the abstract maybe, but not the rest of it. So we have to look at the whole field of publications with 4 million articles published every year. That's 11,000 a day or more. No one can read that. We have to publish less and not more today. And that will balance things about languages, you see. No one can read all these articles today. And we have to draw back, and bibliometrics, of course, won't tell us that, because their business is on the increasing amount of publications. We have a terrible, I think we are moving into a ecological crisis of publications. We are warming up the planet with too many articles to be published, you see. There's a very good team in Argentina of ecologists in Argentina and Chile in the south who have looked into this, and they say the more we publish, the less they read us. And this has to do with economy. The publications field is supply side economy today. That means that everyone needs to publish, everyone needs to throw things on the market, and no one the citation index is governing us, but the citation index is going to come down in a very soon time. In Europe, it's already not the reference, and worldwide there's a revolution against citation index in the same. So I remember an article published by some Polish colleagues who quote me as someone who is involved in wishful thinking, Sirpic and Mansak, about the Englishization of academy, and they quote an article by me and say, "Oh, this gentleman from Mexico doesn't really understand what's all about." I think they're wrong. We have to move away from Englishization, and the Chinese are moving away from that. They're moving back into publishing in their own language and in other languages, because they were cheated. They were told, if you all publish in English, then you will be part of the international scientific society and you will be quoted. And everyone knows today that even if every one of you, if we publish in English, we're not quoted at the same ratio as Anglo-Saxon central authors are quoted. So let's overcome this illusion. I think it's very important to understand. I was at a presential conference 3 months ago. Yes, I traveled to Tallinn, Estonia. There was a very interesting international conference on languages, regional language and higher education. And Estonia, they have an endemic language spoken by 1,200,000 people. They really care about their language and science. They publish in Estonian and they have relationships with their neighbors. And they are really conscientious of the importance that local and regional languages are used for science, because this is fundamental for scientific thought. It's not only, and Lucía knows that from her publications, that we publish in English or some other, it's the discourse models and the cultural models that are behind our science that we have to care about. And if we accept the imposition of a model from the Anglo-Saxon world, it's not only the language, it's the cultural model of how we do science and the discourse model that is imposed. And I think that's very important. I'm not going to talk too long. I've looked into the total disaster. Well, in Estonia, I had the opportunity to speak to a high-ranking NATO military official who was in Afghanistan and was in Iraq. And he told me about the total disaster there among the NATO troops who didn't understand each other. not so much because of language, but because of different cultural models, and about the total disaster of NATO troops in Afghanistan who did not understand what was going on in the country. So the big disaster of the United States today is their incapability of nation building in Afghanistan. And their incapability of nation building is that their model doesn't work anymore. And that they are becoming more and more monolingual in English, and they don't understand the world anymore. There are think tanks, there are theoreticians about what goes on in the world, are producing models and conclusions which are not related to the world anymore. I'm in Mexico and from Mexico, and we are their neighbors, and we know what it means to be a neighbor to the United States. So we have to look at things in a more thorough way. That's very important that you in Poland and people in Estonia and other European countries develop your own science. Use English, of course. I do. English is a nice language. I used to be an English teacher. And when I traveled to the United States, which is a wonderful country, I was a visiting professor in Stanford years ago, I pull out my best British English because then they respect me a little bit. I don't speak American English, I speak British English. That's the only thing they respect a little bit. So I think we have to be much more confident in our own science, in our own development, in our own regional organization than we are so far. I mean, that's the last point. Long time ago, several of you may not have been born at that time, there was a World Congress of Sociology in Mexico City. And there were wonderful, very sophisticated Polish sociologists who participated, and they spoke French and Russian at that time. That was in 1982, a while ago. So we have to build on multilingualism, plurilingualism again, and use other different languages. Most universities in Brazil, Kyria can confirm this, have more academic relationships to French universities than to universities in the United States. So why should they communicate with people in France in English? No reason. They should do it on a bilingual basis with French and Portuguese, and with the Spanish and Portuguese, and have some intercomprehension working there. I think we have to be more optimistic. And so you in Poland, find European language, find international language, and automatic translation is going to help us in the future. So we don't have to be so pessimistic about the world governance of English. It's going down. And let us not be drawn into the US-American disaster which is approaching. And I say that as a neighbor of the United States. Sorry, I talked for too long a time.
Thank you, Rainer. Lucy, would you like to address Rainer's comment?
Well, first of all, thank you. It's an honor that you've joined to meet me in as much as in person as is possible. And I really liked the first analogy that you made, because as long as we keep measuring science performance in countries according to their paper output, and it's the same as measuring a country's prosperity with GDP. It doesn't really reflect reality. And I also think that nowadays we have this huge need to produce content mandate, let's say, this instruction that you need to be producing content the whole time. And it doesn't apply only to sciences, although this productivism in science and the push to publish more and more is very clear. But in other fields of of intellectual or cultural production, there's more and more people writing books or writing newsletters or recording podcasts than are readers or listeners. So yes, that's something that we should really need to reflect upon, this drive to put ourselves out there, to read, to write, to produce, to throw products into the market, whether it's the scientific field or the broader intellectual production field, with no regard of who is really on the other side reading or hearing that. I think that's a very interesting angle.
Okay, I believe we have time for one more question. If you would like to ask Lucy, there is the final call. Yes, I see Ola's hand. Ola.
Thank you, Lucy, for your wonderful presentation. I was actually wondering if you could say a little bit more about what kind of writing support your participants were getting, because you said that they needed more, but are there any programs or like courses that like PhD students can take in terms of scientific writing, or not only like in English but also in like Spanish or Portuguese? And is there any like just like a program or agenda in general to support them in writing production?
Yes. There is, but very scattered and not really systematic in terms of, okay, this is a policy that we are going to implement in every research institute. It really depends on the place. For example, I myself teach academic writing at the School of Law here in Cordoba, but it's an optative subject that you can take it up if you want. And so the law students that we get there are those who have this disposition to the broader field of social sciences, and that maybe will be interested in doing some research apart from the professional exercise of being a lawyer. And many courses or that have come up in my interviews were set up because there was a critical number of researchers that asked for it. So I think that there's definitely a space there for writing spaces and writing workshops, for example, to grow, because as it is right now, it's very it really depends on the institution and and how vocal scholars are in putting across that need, and how receptive authorities are into giving place or organizing something that will be sustained in time and will not be a one-off day of, okay, let's learn how to write an abstract.
Yeah, thank you for that clarification.
And thank you, Lucy, for the very inspiring, as we see, presentation. Thank you for all of you for this discussion, which raised a lot of interesting issues and suggestions. And I hope we can meet also via Zoom in upcoming seminars in February and March. We will inform you via Twitter and via newsletter. If you would like to subscribe to our newsletter, in the chat there is a link posted by Christian. And stay safe and healthy, and see you soon, hopefully in February seminar of our group. Thank you.
Thank you all of you for this debate and this wonderful exchange, and hopefully we'll see each other again.
Muchas gracias, Lucía, y que te vaya muy bien. No sé si ustedes entienden español, pero nosotros nos comunicamos en español. Muy bien. Thank you.
Muy bien.
Chao, gracias, Enrique.